School for Dialogue. I'm delighted and privileged to spend this evening with you. And as I looked at the schedule of the summer school, of this ecumenical school, I've seen many interesting topics already covered. And that gives some platform for my lectures this evening. I also would like to commend the initiative of the Institute of Ecumenical Studies of Ukrainian Catholic University for this wonderful initiative, which is very important. And I hope it will bear good fruits, not only for Catholic University, but also for the participants from different countries. So the theme of my presentation today would be Ukrainian Protestants and the ecumenical movement. And in a few minutes later, I'll share why we would need some preliminary discussion of the topic before going into it, because the title of the topic is already a little bit self-contradictory, or we may say dialectical by its nature. Well, we'll see. In Protestant sense, when we talk in general, I mean kind of all Protestants as a part of Christian family, ecumenism would be regarded as a movement aimed to achieve unity and joint activities, both in worship and in charity, of Christian churches while maintaining their theological and organizational differences. This is very important aspects of unity, but not merging, not organizational unity, unity that permits each participant of the ecumenical movement to preserve, to maintain its theological and organizational peculiarities. As you probably heard during this school, the formal or institutional ecumenical movement was started by the World Missionary Conference in 1910 in Edinburgh, and its theological framework was defined by the New Testament doctrine of the unity of all who believed in Christ. And after the First World War, this movement became more active. There was International Missionary Council established in 1921, then the movement Life and Work in 1925, then the movement Faith and Order in 1927, and after the Second World War, World Council of Churches was established at its first assembly in Amsterdam in 1948. This is kind of institutional aspect. So when we talk about Ukrainian Protestants and ecumenism, it's quite a complicated issue for many reasons. First reason, what would we mean by Ukrainian Protestants? Until 1991, Ukraine was not an independent state. Since the Reformation, Ukrainian lands been a part of different states of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. We will touch this issue of Austrian-Hungarian Empire, of Turkish Ottomanian Empire. Parts of Ukraine have been part of this state, Poland, Soviet Union. So in those times, being part of different states, to what measure we have a justification to talk about Ukrainian Protestantism, for instance, in 16th century or in 17th century, or even at 19th century? Because always, or in the Russian Empire, in Austrian-Hungarian Empire, or earlier in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Ukrainian Protestantism existed as a part of the broader movement, or Protestantism in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or in Austrian Empire, or in the Russian Empire. So we need to have this broader picture in view, and to see this political aspect of Central Eastern European life during the last 5 centuries in order to understand better what it means to be a Ukrainian Protestant. the other very important issue that I need to touch a bit is that we need to have a clear demarcation between the early or classical Protestantism and late or evangelical Protestantism. Because in most cases, when you talk to Catholic or to Orthodox and mention Protestantism, they would talk about Lutheranism or Reformed Church or Anglican Church or some other classical Protestant denominations. You know, I have a colleague in Ukraine in Kiev Theological Academy of Russian Orthodox Church, and he recently published a book, or it's almost published, on Protestantism for the students of Orthodox Theological Academy seminary. But this book touched almost exclusively Lutheranism, Reformed tradition, Anglican Church, but it is not quite relevant to Ukraine, especially at its current state. I would say that 95% of Ukrainian Protestants right now at this period of time and for last at least 100 years would be late or evangelical Christians, evangelical Protestants, which are quite different from classical Protestant denomination. And it is very important to remember about that, and we will touch this issue later. So now we will go a little bit to the history of Protestantism in Ukraine. In beginning of 16th century, right after the Reformation, most of Ukrainian territories, I would say probably 90% of Ukrainian territories, were part of such large state at that time that was the largest state in Europe, known as Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that united a huge territories from Baltic to Black Sea, including Poland, Lithuania, contemporary Belarusia, Ukraine, even some Russian territories and some other territories around, like Moldavia. And this state was quite different from many other European states at that time because of high level of religious freedom, at least at the first part of 16th century in this country. Due to its specific character, because it was countries that united peoples of different nations and different faiths. Well, at least before Reformation, Catholics and Orthodox citizens of this Commonwealth had to learn how to exist together, how to get along. And we know that in the cities of Poland, of Lithuania, of Ukraine, that was part of the state, there was a huge German population. And from historical records, we may say that first Lutheran gathering was established in Grand Duchy of Lithuania in Vilnius back to 1527. So just 10 years after the beginning of Reformation, first Lutheran communities, gatherings were already established in Lithuania and later in Poland. And for first 20 years, since 1520s to 1540s, most of Protestants in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were German Lutherans. And if you studied a bit the history of European Lutheranism, you would know that mostly, especially at 16th century, that was German movement, which had in mind spreading German culture, German language, and those Lutheran communities, they didn't see any reason or task to go into the mission or to preach the Lutheranism to Slavic people. So mostly they were German communities. However, in 1930s and 1940s, sorry, not 1915, 1540s and 1550s, we see a huge spread of Reformed or Calvinist movement in the whole Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, especially in Lithuania, and those parts of Ukraine that formerly were not part of Polish crown, but part of Great Grand Duchy of Lithuania, like Volhynia and some other part of Ukraine. And Ukrainian historians talk about from 200 to 300 of Reformed communities in Ukrainian lands at that period of time, first part of 16th century. Now, comparing with Catholic Church or with Orthodox Church of that time that had thousands of communities, 200 or 300 of Reformed communities doesn't look like a big movement. However, when we go deeper and study the influence of those Protestant communities a little bit more deeper, we would see that cultural and educational activity of Protestant communities, especially of Reformed communities, had a significant influence on Ukrainian culture and on Ukrainian Orthodox Church. After the starting its movement in Ukraine, both Lutheran and especially Reformed and later Anti-Trinian communities started a broad cultural activity, educational activities. There were a few wonderful schools established in Ukrainian lands by Reformed churches, especially in Panivtsi, in Podolia, that actually were of very high level of education. They started a huge publishing activity, polemic with Catholics, and explanation of Reformed doctrines. And which is very important, Protestantism brought to Ukraine the culture of Bible translations. And actually, first Ukrainian Bible translations were inspired by Protestant movement in Ukraine, bringing the national language into liturgies and theological discussion. Well, we have to know that at that time, at 15th and 16th century, Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture in Ukraine was in decline. And most of Ukrainian educated people would speak Latin or Polish, and Ukrainian language was kind of a language of low people, not a language of culture. However, Protestants in Lithuania, in Ukraine, and in Poland especially, tried to use national languages for theological discussion, for liturgies, and for translations of the Bible. And later, this influence had a great significance on establishing Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And there is my good colleague, a professor of Ukrainian Catholic University, Victoria Lubashchenko, and she is the best Ukrainian scholar of Protestantism for last, I believe, 25 years. And she has a lot of wonderful publications on this topic. So she tried to promote the idea that we should see emergence of Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church also as a part of the larger reformational movement on Eastern European lands. And the same approach she uses analyzing reforms of Metropolite Petromohyla and his reforms in Orthodox Church later in 17th century. So we should kind of keep it in mind that even though the Reformed and Lutheran movement was not big in amount, and we talk about a few hundreds of communities, its publishing, cultural, literary, translational activity had a significant influence on Ukrainian Orthodox and to some point Catholic culture. Also, I would like to mention one interesting topic which relates a little bit to ecumenical activity of that period. After the establishing of Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church we know from history that there was a huge polemic between Ukrainian Greek Catholic and Ukrainian Orthodoxes. And we know that patron of Ukrainian Orthodox movement, Prince of Ostrog Constantine, he tried to use the resources of Ukrainian and Polish Protestants in his polemic with Catholics. And some of the most famous Ukrainian Orthodox polemical pieces of that time, like Apokrysis of Christophor Philolet, were actually written by Polish and Ukrainian Protestants who wrote because Constantine, Prince of Ostrog, actually asked them to do so. And he even had in mind this huge idea of collaboration and coalition of Eastern Orthodox and Reformed in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth working together in order to defend their rights and rights of their adherents in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. However, this interesting idea, it never brought many fruits, but that was an interesting ecumenical experiment, I would say, back to 16th century experiment whose essence was to put together the best resources of Ukrainian Orthodox and Reformed theologians and also noble people in order to struggle together with the Polish-Lithuanian state and its religious politic. However, in the middle of 17th century, as we know, Ukraine went through the huge crisis known as Cossack War, war for independence between Ukraine and Poland. And this period of time actually brought to death, we may say, Ukraine classical Protestant movement, because during those almost 20 years of constant war, Ukrainian Protestants were regarded mostly as people who are foreign to Ukrainian national interest, as someone who supports Polish government. And during those hard times, most of Ukrainian Protestant communities, both Lutheran and Reformed, actually ended its existence. So this is a part of Ukrainian history that is related to classical Protestant movement in Ukraine. However, in beginning of 19th century, we may talk about a second wave of Ukrainian Protestantism, and it's not this classical Protestant theological movement of Lutheran or Reformed traditions, but we may talk about Ukrainian Evangelical Protestantism or Ukrainian late Protestantism. And there are many historical discussions and huge polemic among Ukrainian, Russian, and some Western historians. Is this Ukrainian evangelical movement of local origin, maybe talk about of a native Ukrainian evangelical movement, or the Western influence is more important? I would say that probably the truth is somewhere in between. We have both a strong Western influence of Western missionaries and Lutheran and Mennonite priests who were in Ukraine at that time, but also we may give some attention to local, national, I would say, God-seeking movements in Orthodox Church. So this Ukrainian Evangelical Protestantism, it emerges in beginning of 19th century in Central and Eastern Ukrainian lands. So after the 1772, when Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was divided for the first time and then a few more times, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth ended to exist. And its lands were divided between Austrian-Hungarian Empire, Prussian Kingdom, and Russian Empire. And most of Ukrainian lands, except of Halician territory and Bukovina became part of Russian Empire with dominating Orthodox Church. And there, in regions of Kiev, of Poltava, of Odessa, and other places, in the end of 18th century and in the beginning of 19th century, there was a large migrational movement. Those territories were not populated, and Russian government invited many Germans and other people from Europe to settle and develop those lands, especially south of Ukraine, like Odessa region and Tavri and other places. And many of those settlements were Protestants, and during long time of coexistence with Ukrainian population, they started to spread Protestant ideas among Ukrainians. And in 1820s and 1830s, first Ukrainian evangelical communities emerged in Kiev, Poltava, Katerinoslav, and other central and eastern Ukrainian regions. So this movement is quite different from classical Protestant movement. Its theology is more radical, I would say, and this Protestant movement is not magisterial Reformation. It's more of influence of radical Reformation that requires from church to be totally separated, both from government and from social life and from society. So this is quite a radical Protestant movement, and it insisted on total separation from Orthodox and Catholic churches as dead and apostate religious organizations. So when we talk about beginning of Ukrainian evangelical movement, actually there are no reasons to say something about its ecumenical impetus or interest. The idea was quite different: to separate itself from any traditional Ukrainian religious movement as apostate organizations that have wrong theology and wrong moral life. So this situation, we may observe, was until the beginning of 20th century. Here, I need to mention one more other important issue. In the first years of 20th century, we notice the beginning of other very important Protestant movement known now as Pentecostalism or Pentecostal movement. And actually, it's also a big discussion. May we talk about Pentecostalism as just as a part of evangelical movement, or rather, as many contemporary scholars say, we have all reasons to talk about evangelical Pentecostal movement, not just as a Pentecostal, as a part of evangelical movement. Why? Because as we know, since second part of 20th century, Pentecostal experience of baptism, Holy Spirit, and spiritual gifts became integral part of many other Christian traditions, not of evangelical origins, but Catholic Church and some mainline classical Protestant churches like Anglican or Lutheran, and also to some small point also as part of Orthodox tradition. So in the first years of 20th century, in the United States of America, early Pentecostal movement emerged. And during first, I would say, 10-15 years of its history, Pentecostal movement sought to be a sort of uniting movement for all Christian body, for all Christian traditions. The fathers of Pentecostalism didn't have in mind creating another denomination among thousands of other Protestant denominations. They believed that this unique experience that they had is a beginning of restoration of apostolic church, and this movement will, like a wave, spread among all Christianity and bring it to the unity beyond formal doctrine and structure, to the unity of spiritual experience, of common spiritual experience. So early Pentecostals highly believed in non-doctrinal unity in the spirit, in grassroots or in relational unity that would unite church as organism, as a body, not just as an organization. However, there were some issues both inside of Pentecostal movement and also in its perception among both Protestant and other Christian denominations. First of all, Pentecostals interpreted their experience of baptism of the Holy Spirit as continuation of the early church practice. And this impetus of restorationism led them to critical attitude to other Christian churches for the lack of charismatic practices in those churches. So in the beginning of 20th century, this contributed to the alienation of Pentecostals from existing churches, which, in their opinion, fell into the deadly web of traditions and teachings. And this feeling of spiritual superiority did not allow Pentecostals for any cooperation with the existing churches. This is inside reason, but there was also outside reason. When the Pentecostal communities emerged initially in the United States, then in actually many countries, and this year we celebrate in Ukraine 100th anniversary of Ukrainian Pentecostal movement, which actually was supposed to be celebrated last year, but because of known reasons, we shifted it to this year. So most churches, even Protestant churches, when they had some experience with Pentecostal gatherings, with its quite emotional, sometimes eccentric liturgical practices, they were shocked, they were not ready to accept Pentecostals as a fellow Christians. So both Reformed, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Anglican, and even Baptist denominations back to 1920s, 30s, 40s were quite critical in their opinion about Pentecostals, both in the United States, in North America, and Europe, and actually in Ukraine as well. So that led Pentecostals to this self-estimations as a remnant, you know, as a only true Christian body. And this specific feeling also motivated their alienation from existing churches. So this is the situation to the beginning of 20th century. However, I would like also to mention a few more, I would say to some point, positive aspects. After the Second World War, part of Western Ukrainian territories like Galicia and Volyn became a part of Poland, of Second Polish Republic, since 1919. And in 1925, here at Western Ukraine, we noticed a beginning of spread of another branch of Ukrainian Protestantism, of classical Ukrainian Protestantism, known as Ukrainian Evangelical Reformed Movement. Ukrainian Evangelical Reformed Movement. Since 1925, it spread here at Western Ukraine territories. First Ukrainians at modern times who became Reformed Christians were Ukrainian immigrants in North America, in Canada and in the United States. You know that since the end of 19th century, we have a huge wave of Ukrainian labor migration to many different parts of the world, to South America, to North America, to other parts of the world, and especially to Canada and to United States. And their Ukrainian religious life was not yet established. And many Ukrainians started to visit different churches, and also Protestant and Reformed churches. And in the beginning of 20th century, there was a new organization created in the United States called Ukrainian Evangelical Alliance that in 1925 sent here to Western Ukraine its missionaries. And I actually devoted to the history of Ukrainian Evangelical Reformed Church my PhD dissertation, so I would like briefly to stop here in some more detail because it's quite interesting movement. It's a movement that tried to put together classical, Reformed, or you may say Calvinist theological heritage with strong national feelings and faithfulness to Ukrainian national life. So since 1925, in different regions of Galicia, the missionaries of Ukrainian Evangelical Reformed Church started to build their communities. And it's interesting that because of some internal tensions in Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, some Ukrainian intellectuals and even priests of Greek Catholic Church actually joined to Ukrainian Evangelical Reformed movement. I would like to mention, for instance, a Greek Catholic priest, Volodymyr Fediev from Kolomea, that became a pastor of this Ukrainian Evangelical Reformed movement and been a pastor of this church for 25 years. But after the Second World War, when Soviet came, he actually became a Orthodox priest and was sent back to Siberia to be an Orthodox priest. So this dear brother during his life was Greek Catholic priest, Reformed pastor, and then he ended his life as an Orthodox priest. But also I would like to mention, for instance, Fyodor Stashinsky, that was a secretary and librarian of Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, and also he became a priest of Ukrainian Lutheran Church of that time. And also I would like to mention, and I'll talk a little bit more about him, Theodor Yarchuk, who became also one of the most known Ukrainian Protestant theologian in first half of 20th century. You know, I'm very happy that now Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is much more ecumenically oriented. But at that time, in the first half of 20th century, the situation here in Western Ukraine was very complicated. And the relations of Ukrainian Reformed Church and Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church were not very positive, I would say, were not peaceful. Ukrainian Calvinists belonged to a religion recognized by Polish law. And actually, there was a big Polish Reformed Church. However, Greek Catholic clergy treated their activities as sectarian. And we may see quite many harsh criticism of Ukrainian Reformed movement in pastoral messages of the bishop, as well as theological wars and popular publications. The main accusations against Reformed movement were that they ruin a national and religious unity of Ukrainians, they create a threat of religious confrontation, and they use national mottos, national feelings to spread their views. So the faithful of Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church were forbidden to attend Protestant services, to read literature published by them, and even if Ukrainian Protestants would be part of some social organizations like educational organizations or charitable organization, so in those cases, Ukrainian Greek Catholics were not permitted to cooperate with Protestants in one local organizations. And this confrontation often escalated into conflicts. And the Galician press has repeatedly stated the facts of the beating of evangelical pastors and the faithfuls of a Reformed Church. For example, in 1926, in the village Molodyatin near Kolomea, encouraged by local priest Alexander Bolitsky, the crowd beat pastors from Kolomea and local Calvinists. And in February 1926, the Stanislav Eparchy issued an order obliging Greek Catholic priests to inform local authorities about planned Calvinist services in order to prevent them. So it took some time for all of us to learn how to accept each other. And in those difficult times in 1920s and 30s, when Western Ukraine, both socially and religiously and politically, was quite a turbulent territory, we may understand the reasons for those religious tensions. However, I would like to mention that this existence in confrontation with Polish state, with Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, actually had some good results. Ukrainian Protestants of Western Ukraine, like Reformed and Lutheran and Baptist and Pentecostals, started to understand the need of cooperation and of some ecumenical dialogue. And in 1928, here at Mykolaiv, not far from Lviv, was signed of agreement of fraternal and good neighborly relations between Ukrainian Reformed Christians and Ukrainian Baptist Christians. It's actually one of the first such documents in history of Ukrainian Protestantism. And this agreement provided that the parties would coordinate their missionary activities, settle possible misunderstandings through arbitration, and will cooperate in the field of education and upbringing of youth. And in 1927 and 1928, here at Western Ukraine, the leadership of major Ukrainian Protestant denominations like Reformed, Baptist, and Pentecostals tried to create sort of Ukrainian Evangelical association that would help them to unite, to settle some dialogue, and to learn how to cooperate. And actually, part of Ukrainian Pentecostals, which were in the city of Kremenets, in contemporary Ternopil region, there was a very educated pastor, Demyan Harasevich, who actually returned there from United States of America. They also joined into the cooperation with major Ukrainian Protestant denomination. However, I should say that those ecumenical activities didn't have significant achievements, both for objective reasons, as also doctrinal differences, subordination to various church structures, and even more to subjective, personal misunderstandings between leaders of different groups. Also, when we talk about this period between First and Second World Wars, I would like to mention one more very interesting Ukrainian Christian movement. It is Ukrainian Lutheran Church. Yes, as I mentioned in the beginning of my lecture, Lutheran have existed in Ukraine since beginning of 16th century. However, in 16th, 17th, and beginning of 18th century, Lutheran communities were German communities without any contact and relations with Ukrainian culture. However, when Western Ukrainian lands became part of Austrian and then later Austrian-Hungarian Empire, many Germans emigrated to Galicia, to Bukovina, to Zakarpattia, and other Ukrainian regions. Mostly they were officials, engineers, and other people. And many of those Germans were all Lutherans or Calvinists. So in order to meet their religious needs, Austrian government organized a church, which was actually a church that put together into one organizational body, both German Calvinists and German Lutherans. And actually, in Austrian-Hungarian times, that church had a state support. After collapse of Austrian-Hungarian Empire, this church continued to exist as part already of Polish state, in Polish state. And in the beginning of 1920s, this church started to preach, to contact with Ukrainian population. There was a pastor, Theodor Zekler, in Stanislavia, who actually came there from Germany, learned Ukrainian language, and developed a huge cultural and especially social and charitable activity in that region. And because of this new politic of openness of this German church to Ukrainians, in 1920s, there was a new movement established known as Ukrainian Lutheran Church. And as I already mentioned, this church drew attention of some Ukrainian intellectuals and Greek Catholic priests. I have mentioned already Fyodor Stashinsky, who was Greek Catholic priest and librarian of Metropolitan Andrei Sheptitsky. But the most famous person of this movement was Theodor Yarchuk. He studied Catholic theology in Rome and wanted to become a Greek Catholic priest. But when he returned to Stanislavia for vacations, he attended a German Lutheran church in Stanislavia, contemporary Ivano-Frankivsk, and he was convinced by the preaching, by the sermon, so he decided to become a pastor of Ukrainian Evangelical Lutheran community in Stanislavia. So he continued his education in Germany, got his degree in theology, returned to Stanislavia, and for 15 years was the most prominent leader of Ukrainian Lutheran movement. In 1933, Yarchuk compiled first Ukrainian Evangelical prayer book, служебник, as we call it in Ukrainian Evangelical prayer book. And the unique aspect of this prayer book was that Yarchuk reworked the liturgy of John Chrysostom and other Orthodox rites and services in accordance with Lutheran doctrine. So Ukrainian Lutheran Church became the first Lutheran church in the world that tried to put together Lutheran theology and Byzantine Eastern Orthodox liturgical heritage. So his prayer book was based on the Eastern Orthodox rite, while incorporating theology from the divine service contained in Luther's Formula Missae, the base text of Lutheran liturgies in the West. And however, Theodor Yarchuk was tortured and killed in Stanislavia by communist authorities in 1941. And many Ukrainian Lutheran laypersons were also sent to Gulag, where they died. During the time of the persecution of Christians in the Soviet Union, property of Lutheran Church was expropriated, and the same destiny met also Ukrainian Reformed Church. Most of its pastors were emigrated or were tortured by communist government. I would like also especially mention the pastor Teodosy Dovgaluk, who was a very fluent author and great leader and theologian and writer, and who also was tortured in 1941 when the Soviet army was leaving Western Ukraine. And after the collapse of USSR, both Ukraine Lutheran Church and Ukraine Reformed Church experienced some revival. However, they do not have that success that they had back to 1920s and 30s. And today, Ukrainian Reformed Church would enlist probably 5 or 6 communities in Ukraine. And Ukrainian Lutheran Church has maybe 25 gatherings in Ukraine, maybe with 1,000 of members of each church. So comparing with huge other evangelical denominations in Ukraine, that's a significant minority. And now we may turn our attention to Soviet time. After the 1944, for the first time, almost all Ukrainian territories were united in one state, in Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, actually as a part of Soviet Union. And here I would like to mention a few key events. Well, in Soviet Union, back to 1920s and 30s, especially 30s, the religious politics was quite anti-Christian, I would say. In 1920s, it was different. You know, the time of new economical politics and other social experiments. So back to 1920s, in Soviet Union, Protestants had quite a freedom of consciousness. And there was a strong, huge Protestant revival in former Soviet Union back to 1920s. However, starting since 1928, and especially 1929, Soviet government changed its politics toward Protestants. And both Pentecostal Union and Baptist Union were actually destroyed till the beginning of 1930s. Hundreds of pastors were or tortured or sent to Gulag. When we talk about Pentecostals, actually, and its governing structure, almost all bishops of Ukrainian Pentecostal Church were or tortured or sent to prison. The same was with Baptist Union. The same was with other Protestant denominations. However, during Second World War, Soviet Union had to change its religious politics. One of the reasons was the influence of its Western alliance, especially Great Britain and also United States of America. They required from Stalin and from Soviet government to let Protestants to have at least some forms of legal existence in Soviet Union. So in 1944, it was established of the Union of Evangelical Christians and Baptists. 1944, Union of Evangelical Christians and Baptists, later known as All Ukrainian Union of Evangelical Christian Baptists. That was actually the only legitimate Protestant denomination in Soviet Union until 1989. So almost for 55 years, 45 years actually, 45 years. There were some small Protestant denominations in Baltic countries, like Lutheran country in Estonia, and Lutheran church in Estonia, and Lutheran church in Lithuania, but those were small and Lutheran churches. However, all Soviet evangelical Christians were forced and pressed to join this only permitted Protestant denomination. In 1944, Pentecostals pressured also to join this union. The government interest in uniting these denominations was perceived by the faith communities as an attempt to control them better, and actually true, and provoke them to fight each other, which is also true. For instance, we may recall a harsh discussion regarding infant or adult baptism, like some, Mennonites, they practiced adult baptism, but they were forced to become a poor part of this union, and they wouldn't agree with Baptist doctrine of adult baptism. And also discussions between Baptists and Pentecostals regarding the baptism of Holy Spirit. So the goal of the government was to liquidate those communities with greater ease putting them into the confrontation. And many churches that failed to cooperate in forming this union could be closed by the government. And actually, we may talk about underground, both Baptist and Pentecostal movements that emerged because they didn't want to become the part of this official state Protestant, state-permitted Protestant church. However, which is important for our election today, despite the differences, liturgical, structural differences, differences of tradition, despite theological disagreements, many of these churches came to recognize the need to cooperate with each other in the hostile atheistic society and try to build friendship between their communities. So even if the goal of the state in putting all the Protestants into one denomination was quite obvious, to control and to create internal split and discussions, the final fruits were also positive, because for the first time, Protestants, Evangelical Protestants, were forced to learn how to live together, how to serve together, how to peacefully resolve all conflict issues, and together stand against harsh atheistic politics. So here we may say there are some roots of Ukrainian Protestant I would say, ecumenical movement. Baptists and Pentecostals were depicted in Soviet propaganda as being dangerous and unintelligent. The goal of the Soviet government was to root out all religion, and churches were considered as enemies of the state and people. But at the same time, churches, and Protestant churches too, played an important role in cooperating with the state on an international level by giving a positive depiction of Soviet society. And since both Baptists and Pentecostals and Mennonites had many brothers and sisters in the United States of America, in Great Britain, in Scandinavia, and in other Western countries, Soviet Union decided to use their relations for their political ends. And the main areas of international activity of the both Orthodox and Protestant churches were struggle for peace. You probably remember this motto from Soviet times, if you are as old as me. Exposing of anti-Soviet propaganda in foreign countries, and explaining to the international community of the church's position in the USSR and the Soviet religious policy. In this activity, the churches and religious organizations of Soviet Union had to act together like one front, ignoring any differences of dogmatic nature. In addition, smaller denominations like Baptists were to move in the fairway of the Russian Orthodox Church. So it was a quite difficult time for them. You know, those strategies for the struggle for peace were developed based on communist ideology and aimed to consolidate the reputation of USSR as a peacemaker, as well as undermine the authority of Western countries, imposing on them the image of aggressors. So special Soviet agencies like the Councils of Religious Affairs and others, and KGB, they approved all public statements of church representatives on those issues, and it was all controlled under by the Soviet authorities. However, at the end of 1950s, the representatives of Baptist Union as well as Orthodox Church became members of the World Peace Council since 1962, the Soviet Committee for the Defense of Peace, the Soviet Committee for the Defense of the Countries of Asia and Africa. In addition, the members of the Soviet churches became the part of Christian Peace Conference, founded in 1958, and the World Council of Churches, which sought to turn into a sphere of Soviet denomination was deemed appropriate. So this was part of Soviet time and history of Ukrainian Protestantism of Soviet times. And at the same time, in the Western world, there were some very important changes, transformations launched after the Second Council of Vatican. Unfortunately, in Ukraine, and I believe maybe in other Eastern European countries, both Protestants and sometimes Catholics are not aware of the scale of dialogues between Roman Catholics and Protestants starting at 1960s. As a representative of Protestant community of Ukraine, I know that maybe 5 or 10 Ukrainian Protestants are aware that such dialogues take place for such long period of time. So the heritage of this, of those dialogues is unknown actually for Ukrainian Protestantism. And I believe we have somehow to meet this situation and to answer it. For instance, in December 2012, a dialogue between Mennonites, Lutheran, and Catholics was launched for the first times, and the exchange allowed the three parties to see the theological differences between infant baptism and adult baptism and consider the possibility of mutual recognition of this sacrament. In May 2016, representative of the World Baptist Union and the Pontifical Council for the Christian Unity met in Rome to discuss the third phase of their dialogue, which started in 1984. Also, the same dialogue is running with Pentecostals. And a good friend of mine, Belgian evangelical theologians, Dele Kremers, successfully defended dissertation on Pentecostal Catholic ecumenical dialogue that has more than 50 years of history. However, for Ukrainian Protestants who lived in Soviet Union, this dialogue did not have any meaning because they lived under Iron Curtain and were not aware of those developments. So now we may go to the independency period. In 1991, Ukraine became an independent state, and we may put some attention, give some attention to the major developments of this period. So the interesting fact, Ukrainian Baptists were part of the World Church Council until 1991 or 1992. When they received freedom from Soviet restrictions, from KGB, they immediately left World Council of Churches, because World Council of Churches was perceived by most of Ukrainian and Russian Baptists as an apostate organization. So right now, we may say that Ukrainian Protestants do not take part in international do not participate in international ecumenical movement. However, there are some ecumenical initiatives that I would like to mention briefly. I may say that international contacts of Ukrainian Protestants, they are limited to international religious associations, like regional, European, and global. For instance, there is a Pentecostal European Fellowship, and Ukrainian Pentecostals are part of Pentecostal European Fellowship. Ukrainian Baptists belong to European Baptist Federation and World Baptist Federation. There is also an organization called assembly, international assembly of the Christian of Evangelical faith, International Assembly of the Christian of Evangelical faith, actually Pentecostals, that unites Pentecostal from the countries of the former Soviet Unions and also from the countries where they emigrated starting from 1990s, like United States of America and other countries. Also, Ukrainian Protestants participate in all Ukrainian organizations. And among the existing interfaith organization of Ukraine, we can highlight the following. First of all, it's All Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations. All Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations. And just a few days ago, that council celebrated its 30th anniversary. So it includes Orthodox, Catholic, Protestants, Jews, and Muslims. And on November 22, 2017, the Commission on Social Ministry of this All Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations adopted a strategy for the participation of churches and religious organizations in peace building in Ukraine under the title, Ukrainian is our common home. So many Ukrainian Protestants are active members of this All Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations. Most of Ukrainian Protestants belong to Council of Evangelical Protestant Churches of Ukraine. Council of Evangelical Protestant Churches of Ukraine. It was established in April 2005 as a representative and advisory body of Protestant churches. Currently, it consists of 12 Protestant unions or associations like Baptists, Pentecostals, Lutherans, Reformed churches, and some other Protestant churches, like, for instance, Ukrainian Charismatic churches and some free associations. So I would say that Council of Evangelical Protestant Churches of Ukraine is the main representative of consolidate Protestant position in many aspects of social, cultural, and other aspects of life of Ukrainian society. There is also Ukrainian Interchurch Council, Ukrainian Interchurch Council. It's interesting, you know, this Council of Evangelical Protestant Churches of Ukraine, I would say it's Protestant establishment of Ukraine. So all well-accepted Protestant churches with some tradition and history and some level of acceptance in society belong to Council of Evangelical Protestant Churches of Ukraine. But some radical Ukrainian Protestant groups, mostly charismatic and Pentecostal, belong to this Ukrainian Interchurch Council that, however, has a very small influence. And also Protestant participates in all kinds of public councils, for instance, in the Public Council on Religion at the Ministry of Education and Science, Council for Pastoral Care at the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, and some other such public councils. Also, I would like to mention that Protestants are actively present in different regional and local interconfessional and interdenominational initiatives. For example, I'm not aware if there is such practice in other Eastern or Central or Western European countries, but in Ukraine, at many regions and even cities, Christian traditions would unite together on a local level in the form of spiritual or Christian councils. In many regions and cities of Ukraine, those councils exist, and they would include Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestants, who together on a local or regional level try to represent Christian position in dialogue with the local authorities. They initiate all sorts of social, charitable, philanthropic, and other projects. And in some regions of Ukraine have a quite strong influence. One of the most obvious or visual aspects of spiritual councils is the practice of prayer breakfasts, both local, regional, and national, that create a platform where Ukrainian Christians may be in informal dialogue with local and national authorities. Also, I would like to mention a few important social and charitable initiatives that are also supported by Ukrainian Protestants. I'd like to mention Project Understanding Religious Communities and Overcoming the Polarization of Ukrainian Society. As you know, starting 2014 and 13, Ukraine met quite a strong social crisis because of Russian intervention into eastern Ukraine and constant war in eastern Ukrainian territories. And Ukrainian churches understand that they have to play their role in bringing to understanding, in building bridges between Ukrainians of the territory which is controlled by Ukrainian society and which is not controlled by Ukrainian society. And inside of the territories controlled by Ukrainian society, there is still also a polarization. So this project aims to use all the resources of religious communities in order to overcome the polarization and initiate a constant social dialogue in Ukraine. And some good friend of mine, Ukrainian pastor and theologian Taras Dyatlek, represent Protestant tradition in this very important project. Also, I'd like to mention interfaith seminar, Sources of Wisdom and Unity in Diversity. Sources of Wisdom and Unity in Diversity. That is a project of State Service of Ukraine for Ethnopolitics and Freedom of Conscience, which is also supported by Protestant denominations. One other important event that I'd like to mention that helped to bring Protestant at least into initial ecumenical dialogue with other Christian tradition was the celebration of 500th anniversary of the Reformation. In 2017, it was quite a significant event, and actually in Ukraine, that was supported by government. There was a decree of President of Ukraine and also the decision of the Parliament of Ukraine to support this celebration, because Protestantism has a significant influence on Ukrainian history. And the institute that I belong to, Eastern European Institute of Theology, initiated the whole program of celebration of Reformation, and part of this program was a series of roundtables with other Christian traditions. For instance, in 2015, November 3rd, we had a very interesting round table on Reformation and Catholic Church, which was held at the Ukrainian Catholic University. And probably for the first time, we gathered together Ukrainian Protestant and Catholic theologians, where they could present their views on different theological, dogmatic, ethical, social issues, not in a spirit of confrontation, but in a spirit of dialogue and search for understanding. And later, the same month, November 2015, in Kyiv, in National Pedagogical University, we also held a roundtable on Reformation and Eastern Orthodoxy, Reformation and Eastern Orthodox Church, where also we invited key Ukrainian Orthodox theologians like Cyril Huvrun and others, and also key Ukrainian Protestant theologians. And for the whole day, they presented their lectures and had quite friendly discussions regarding different issues. So the celebration of the anniversary of Reformation for the first time in Ukrainian history created a platforms for dialogue, for discussion, for getting to know each other, at least among Ukrainian theologians. And I would like to say here that in Ukraine, we may say that among theologians of key Christian traditions, there is this understanding of the necessity and need of establishing of ongoing dialogue among them. However, I should say that church authorities of most Ukrainian Christian denominations are not ready for such ongoing dialogue and ongoing exchange of views. So I may say that at present time, probably only informal dialogue of Ukrainian theologians is possible. Ukrainian churches are not ready to any formal institutional exchange of views and dialogue on theological issues. I may conclude that in Ukraine, both Protestants and Orthodox and Catholics do not know each other well. And this leads to mutual bias. We discussed a few times with Pavlo Smitsnyuk, director of the Institute of Ecumenical Studies, about a necessity of creating some way how at least priests and clergy of Protestant and Catholic denomination can get to know each other better. And a few weeks ago, there was a wonderful project, summer school for seminarists of key Ukrainian Christian traditions, Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant, who spent a week together listening to lectures of Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox theologians, having fellowship and communication. And I believe this unique experience will help them to overcome any kinds of hostilities they could have and to build those interpersonal bridges for their future ministry. However, those were just 15 seminaries, and we have in Ukraine thousands of them that somehow are not aware of other Christian tradition and have all sorts of prejudice and biases. Maybe we may establish a practice when, for instance, once a year, when there is a sort of regional gathering of priests or pastors, we may invite a representative of other Christian tradition and give him a 30 minutes or an hour just to present its tradition and to answer the questions. However, unfortunately, most of Ukrainian churches are not ready even for such experiments. So, and I'm not saying that Protestants are better than Catholic or Orthodox, maybe sometimes even worse, and they have this feeling of necessity to protect the walls, you know, to keep the purity of doctrine, and do not let those other traditions to undermine their theological purity. So in Ukraine, ecumenical dialogues do not reach the level of discussion of dogmatic differences between Christian churches. They are limited to a search of common position in social programs, in answering the political and spiritual challenges in Ukrainian society. And in this aspect of cooperation, we have some good fruits. However, I believe it is time for Ukrainian churches to make a next step and launch at least informal dialogue between representatives of Ukrainian Christian traditions in order to get to know each other better and to ruin those stereotypes that are so spread among most of Ukrainian Christian tradition. And I have to say that Ukrainian Protestants also have many stereotypes regarding Catholics and Orthodox, sometimes just are not being aware of the theological, practical, liturgical, and spiritual heritage of other Christian traditions.